If you would, open up to Genesis chapter 21. Genesis chapter 21. You may remember from last week of the culmination of God's covenant promises to Abraham and Sarah about giving a son by the name of Isaac to be born to them, and to see over the course of time as God has enabled these things to come together, even giving Sarah the ability to have a son at such an age as 89, 90 years old, and to see how they responded to that covenant keeping of God to follow His commands. And even as it continued on, it gets to the point where Isaac is old enough to be weaned. They throw a great feast. And then look down at verse 9 in Genesis chapter 21. It says, "Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking." Now, if you can kind of notice the age difference here, if you look back at chapter 17 in Genesis and look at verses 24 and 25, this is when Abraham is 99 years old, and it's going to give you what Ishmael's age is. So here in verse 24, it says, "Now Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin." So that tells you that whenever Isaac is born, we know that Abraham's 100 years old. Ishmael is probably about 14 years old. So when you start thinking over here in Genesis 21, it talks about how that Ishmael is mocking that here he is, let's just make a little assumption here. If Isaac is weaned when he's 2 years old, that puts Ishmael around 16 years old at this point in time. Now, there's a kind of a margin of error, +1 or -1, but of a year. But to look at it here and go, here's what Sarah notices. This 16, roughly, year-old boy is making fun of my 2-year-old son. Now, for you mothers, how do you take to other people mocking your children? Do you respond very well to that? Are you patient and kind? Not necessarily, right? Well, take a note of what happens next. Verse 10. "Therefore she said to Abraham, 'Drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac.'" Well, what do you see about her response? Bitter? Now notice, when you notice her response here, what seems to be Sarah's concern? The heir, the inheritance. She's like, he is not going to be a fellow heir with my son. Now, I don't know if this is an aspect of it or not, but whenever you see a 16-year-old picking on a 2-year-old and their siblings, at least half-siblings, you go, if this just keeps on going, what's going to happen with little old Isaac? He's going to pick on him every day of his life. Now, it doesn't bring any of that up here, but specifically it's about, look, he's not going to be an heir with my son Isaac. And her indecision is, Abraham, you just drive him on out. Just get rid of him. Get rid of Hagar, get rid of Ishmael. And once again, whose idea was it to have a child through Hagar? Isn't that something? It was Sarah's idea. I don't know about you, do you ever get really disappointed when you get what you ask for? Maybe you should make us rethink on what we're asking, right? So, here it is. This is what she's done. Then, notice how this continues on a little bit. Just hearing that kind of statement, and I just want you to kind of go down this road with me for a minute. Why would this be so concerning for Abraham to hear his wife, Sarah, say something like this? It's his son. There's still a tie here. Think he still has some care, perhaps, for Hagar and Ishmael, of course. You might think in terms of, well, if I do this, what's going to happen to them? Then even other things about, would that be correct to handle it this way? Is this what God wants for me to do at this point in time? And you realize, once again, Sarah, this was your plan. He doesn't say that, but all these concerns that would easily pop into the head, right? Just on the surface. Richard.
Is he really feeling like the head of his house at this point in time?
All right.
I've got Sarah telling me, this way Ishmael came around, now you're telling me this way, get rid of him.
All right. You realize we feel like he's getting henpecked. But notice how this continues on a little bit on. Now notice it's going to tell you for certain what his real distress is. Those other things are just observations perhaps. But what's really going on here? Look at verse 11. The matter distressed Abraham greatly. Why? Because of his son. Ishmael is my son. I don't want to just throw my son out. I don't want him to just be taken out somewhere else. You see the love that Abraham has for Ishmael. It's something we typically think of, okay, well, Isaac's the son that Abraham really loves. I hope you don't look at that in terms of going, he doesn't have a fond affection for Ishmael. I don't know where we would get that idea from because of specifically here what's in place. Now, I want you to notice the terminology that it uses in verse 11. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. So is this just a little bit of stress? I mean, it's a great distress because of Ishmael. Now, let's kind of make a little bit of application for ourselves. Why do we usually get so distressed? Is it over people that we care for? Is it over circumstances we're not sure how they're going to turn out? Realize a lot of these things are similar. If you look at the word distressed, it really kind of carries with this idea of a mental angst, of kind of a being pulled in two directions at once because of going, well, what are the two opposite pulls at this point in time? Here's Sarah who's saying, just get rid of Hagar and Ishmael and cast them out. And then here's Abraham who says, I'm so very distressed because this is my son Ishmael. And to go, how are you going to have to choose between a wife, Sarah, and a son, Ishmael? Now realize, a little added thought here for a present day situation that happens so often. How many stepmothers want to drive a wedge between a father's son and the father? Does this sound like a present situation that happens? Now, notice here's the point. He says, it distressed him so much, and here's all this uncertainty about driving them out. You may think in terms of here it says distressed, probably sometimes what we think of is the damsel in distress. She's overwhelmed, she needs help. The knight in shining armor shows up. But to realize, men, don't take this in a macho way, because the godly influence of a spiritual wife or woman is worth its weight in gold. So understand that too. But notice here the idea is Abraham is the one who's distressed. And his wife is the one who's causing the distress of trying to make him choose between me or him. Look at verse 12. Let's get the culmination of these things. In the middle of all this great distress, you get verse 12. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. For through Isaac your descendants shall be named. what is the very first thing that God addresses? Don't be distressed. Now, some people might say, well, that's easier said than done. But when God says it, what? Go ahead and finish the statement. There's nothing to worry about. Now, we can see it with Abraham. Can we see it with us? Now, he says, do not be distressed because of the lad. Now, just for terminology's sake, Ishmael's about 16. What's God calling him? A lad. So just notice some of the terminology. We'll need it in chapter 22. He says, and your maid. And how many wives wish the Lord would tell their husbands this very exact thing? Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. And you look at this statement and go, he says, look, do what makes for peace, right? Now, it also makes another statement here. He says, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named. He says, the name is going to come through Isaac, because Isaac's going to later on have a son named who? Jacob. And Jacob's name is going to be changed to Israel. And what are the descendants going to be known as? Israelites. So that's going to come through Isaac. So lays that out. Then look into verse 13. He says, and of the son of the maid I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant. Now notice what he brings up. Why is God going to deal this way with Ishmael? Because he's your son. Which tells you, does God care about Ishmael? And does he care about Ishmael because he is your son? Now, here's something maybe that we've lost sight of. Look back to Genesis chapter 17 again, but now look at verse 20. God addresses Ishmael with Abraham. Genesis 17:20. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him and will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. Not just a nation, but a great nation. It says, going to be 12 princes. If you actually go over to Genesis 25, it'll tell you the 12 names of those 12 sons that Ishmael's going to have. It'll lay them out, each one of them. So they're in verses 12 through 16, and the names are probably some that you may have only heard one or two of them. Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedemah. Now, those names may mean nothing to you, but what do you figure out? What was God telling Abraham? Exactly what was going to take place. So, whenever we get over here to Genesis 21, and in verse 13 it says, you know what? I will make a nation also of Ishmael. It says, because he is your descendant. There's going to be 12 sons that are going to be born of him. Abraham already knew that. Diane? What nation did they become? They actually became a whole bunch of different nations. Most of them being in what we would probably consider to be like Saudi Arabia or the Arabs over around there. It's not tied to just one in particular that we're familiar with in those terms. So then as he picks up here in verse 13, you realize whenever God gives him the direction of saying, do not be distressed, everything had to do with Abraham's response. If he chose faith, what does he know about Ishmael that God has said? Is he going to be okay? Yes. Is he going to have 12 sons? Yes. And he's only 16 at this point in time, so it's not as if he's already got marriage all lined up and everything. Maybe he's just a tad bit older or younger. But you realize in the midst of distress, what's really the right response? Are you going to trust God at what He's promised? Because if Abraham trusts God, he doesn't have to be distressed anymore. Okay, it's going to be fine. If he doesn't have faith, all of a sudden, what do you start asking yourself? Well, what if? Isn't that what happens in the middle of distress? We either have to look at the promises of God or start asking a bunch of what-if questions, and the distress gets even worse. Those options are always present. Now, look at verse 14, and look at how this continues on. You'll see another layer here. Notice Abraham's response. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the boy and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. Does Abraham delay? Nope. Notice how it talks about him. He gets up early in the morning. He says, he took bread, a skin of water. You know, we probably think in terms of like seeing wine skins, but of course for this is about, you know, the idea of a thermos. And so a skin of water, and presents these things to Hagar. And is Abraham doing exactly what Sarah had said? Yeah, but actually even showing some grace. Because Sarah didn't say, well, make sure and give them water and bread when they're on their way out. What was her response? Just get rid of them. And you see, once again, Abraham respond out of faith, grace, and gives these things to her. He says, put them on her shoulder. And notice, now the terminology is not the lad. Now what's he called? The boy. So just know there's a mix and match of terms here, meaning the same thing. And sent her away. And it says, and sure enough, she departs and she wanders, it says, down into the wilderness of Beersheba, which is the farthest south you could get of what's later on going to be the promised land. And later on in chapter 21, it's going to describe more about Beersheba. So you see what's at hand here. And you also understand, in the midst of distress, there's always a choice to be made. Now, keep your place here. We're going to come back. But look over at Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. Look down at verse 32. Speaking of Jesus and the 11, it says, they came to a place named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here until I have prayed. So they come to the Garden of Gethsemane, and whether you're aware of this or not, I'm not sure, but Gethsemane literally means the olive press. And an olive press would be a very large column of stone that would press at an angle against another stone underneath. And you would put olives in between them. And the weight of that top stone, which was very, very high, would press down upon those olives to where the olive oil would come out of them. And you understand, Jesus has come to this place because he's about to be hard pressed. It's just a literal place meaning with exactly what's about to take place. So here he is. He said to his disciples, the 11, sit here until I have prayed. In other gospel accounts it says, you sit here and pray. Verse 33. Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and began to be very distressed and troubled. What's going on inside of Jesus? Very distressed and troubled. Now notice, here's this stress of being pulled in opposite directions. We'll get to that in a second. And he's troubled. And I want you to see how deeply this distress is affecting him. Because look at verse 34. And he said to them, them being Peter, James, and John. My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch. How deep can stress get to you? All the way down to your soul. That is really what you see at hand here with Jesus. Is he being pressed in the garden? To the point he says, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. He says, remain here and keep watch, speaking to Peter, James, and John. Then, verse 35. He says, and he went a little beyond them and fell to the ground and began to pray that if it were possible, the hour might pass him by. What is he praying for at this point? Let this hour pass by. Let this opportunity for my death go by. And you realize here, he says, if it were possible, he says, will you let this go by? And how many times have we gotten to such a stressful point over family, over situations, people that we care about, and we go, I just wish that we didn't have to go through this. If it's possible, let it go by. Verse 36. On the other side. And he was saying, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Notice how he addresses him first. Abba. Now this, of course, is a childlike word, a very immature kind of word, but you know even in your adult years, when your parents are still alive, there are very tender moments where you don't use formal words. And he says, Abba. And you think about how many times whenever your kids were rather young and they came to you very distressed, maybe even in tears, and the answer was simple, but it was beyond them. And you could quickly wipe the tears from their eyes, and you could bring a smile to their face, and the problem is solved. For Jesus, is that going to happen? No. But he says, Abba, he says, I know you can take care of everything. Look at what he says. All things are possible for you. He says, Father, now formal. He says, yet not what I will, but what you will. What is so distressing greatly upon Jesus? He's being pulled in two directions. He's saying, I want this hour to pass by, if it's possible. He says, all things are possible with you. Not my will, but your will be done. And you notice the situation. And all of a sudden, he prays the same thing a second time. He prays it again a third time. And then all of a sudden, Judas and the mob are coming out. And you want to know what Jesus decides? You already know. Whose will did he choose? God's. Do you ever read any more about Jesus being under distress all the way through the end of his life and the death on the cross? What made the distress subside? Obedience to God out of faith. You want to know what the relief for us is when we're under great distress? Am I going to do this God's way? Because whenever you decide to do it his way, what happens to the distress? It goes away. And the longer you go from deciding to do it God's way, what happens to the distress? It just keeps piling on, doesn't it? Until when? till we finally surrender, unless we don't decide. Now, you see what's going on here with Jesus. Come back to Genesis chapter 21. Sometimes those distressing situations bring about a love that says, okay, I love this person enough to confront evil. I love this person enough to show them compassion in their humility. Sometimes it's about seeing that, you know what, there's a judgment that's going to come upon the proud. But you come back to this point, in all this distress that Abraham was under, now all of a sudden you're going to see somebody else be distressed. Look at verse 15. When the water in the skin was used up, she left the boy under one of the bushes. Well, how are the rations going? We've extinguished the water, and she just leaves him underneath one of the bushes. I don't think about a little old tiny shrub that maybe you have in your front yard. Hard to get a 16-year-old underneath there. But notice verse 16. Then she went and sat down opposite him about a bow shot away. Now, however far you want to think about primitive bows shooting, I mean, maybe 100 yards, maybe 200 yards at the very most, who knows. But realizing she gets away from the situation in one sense. And notice where she's at in this. She leaves him there underneath the bushes. Then this is her statement. She says, "Do not let me see the boy die." And she sat opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. Where does distress take you if you let it? What is she assuming? This is a helpless situation. He's going to die. Isn't that what distress does to us? It takes us to the worst possible outcome. Now, what has God already promised is going to happen with Ishmael? He's going to be a father of 12 princes, right? Is he going to die underneath this bush? No. But if you don't respond out of faith, what happens? Distress just gets worse. And you assume you're going to die. Peggy.
Hagar didn't know he was going to be the father of 12 nations.
You do kind of wonder that, don't you? Let's deal with that one. Let's keep going. Notice how we go. He says, she sat opposite him and lifted up her voice, and what does she begin to do? She starts to cry. Have you ever been in so much distress that you're thinking the worst case scenario, and then what happens next? We just start crying. We get overwhelmed. There's too much going on in our brain for our eyes to hold it in. I want to show you something before we move on here. Look over at Psalm 56. And I hope you never forget this. Psalm 56. Just want one verse. Verse 8. Psalm 56, verse 8. David writes this psalm. He starts it off about, "Be gracious to me, O God, for man is trampled upon me. Fighting all day long, he oppresses me." But look down at verse 8. David says, "You have taken account of my wanderings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book?" How personal is God with knowing your tears? He says, I have your tears in a bottle. Think of how many tears you have cried in your life. And to think of God knowing about every single one of them. To where he could even show you a bottle that have your tears in them. And that every teardrop has been accounted for and written where? In his book. Is he aware of what is going on in the hearts and the minds of people? Specifically here to the faithful, because David's the one who writes this. And any time you cry, I want you to think about Psalm 56, verse 8. And don't think you have been forgotten. Never. Because God knows. And He's attentive. Now, come back over to Genesis chapter 21. So, here's Hagar crying her eyes out. My terminology, not here, just says wept. Verse 17. Notice how it continues on. God heard the lad crying. Did you catch that one? Doesn't say Hagar, it says the lad. How's he feeling about all this? He's wondering about all this too. So here he is. It says, God heard the lad crying, and the angel of God, the messenger of God, called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter with you, Hagar? Isn't that an interesting way to start? How would you feel if in the middle of your own pity party, God showed up and said, what's the matter with you? And then called you by name? Would that have your attention? We'd like to think so. And I'm not making fun of her. I'm just saying, notice who you're standing in the presence of in terms of the voice of God through this angel. He says, do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Why tell her that? He's the one with a promise here. He says, don't want to see him die. Does Hagar need to make a move? Yes. The angel says, do not fear. And it's not as if he just says, do not fear and doesn't give any more information. He says, do not fear. He says, for the specific reason of, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. God knows what's going on. He says, I'm attentive to him. Are you ready to make a move and change? Are you ready to see some things by faith? Now, notice how this continues on into verse 18. Arise, lift up the lad and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him. What did she just learn if she had never heard it before? He's going to be a great nation. Same thing we've already read back in chapter 17 before tonight. So you notice the statement, are you going to trust me or are you going to hold to what you think? Isn't that what distress brings upon us? We get pulled in different directions. And God's saying, you going to trust me or are you going to trust you? You going to come up with the worst case scenario? Or are you going to let go of fear and trust me and my promises? Because I'm telling you, I'm going to make him a great nation. Then notice what happens. It continues on. Verse 19. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. What does God do? Had God already provided for them? Because he didn't say that he created the well. Wasn't the well there? But because of distress, what did it do to the answer? It was blocked and hidden from her own eyes. And then all of a sudden, whenever she's going to respond, God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. Is it more than enough to fill her skin? Certainly. He says, oh, you mean you have more than what you need? Let's see, what's the term we use for that? Grace, abundance, those kind of words, right? Oh, you mean you're going to trust God at his word, and all of a sudden you find grace and abundance. So, continues on, so she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. Notice how much, does she care about Ishmael as well? Oh, deeply, deeply. And notice, it doesn't say that she took a drink first, that she went and took it to the lad. Then, you see this picture together. Now, there's kind of a quick summary, a quick grow-up story here for the next two verses in verses 20 and 21. It said, God was with the lad, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and became an archer. He says, you know what? And then the boy grew up. He's not going to stay a teenager forever. And you notice, God was with the lad, and he grew. Remember what Abraham's big concern was? His concern was for the boy. Did God need Abraham when it came for Ishmael to grow into a nation? No. How many times do we as parents need to learn to let go of our kids? We want to be there to take care of everything and make sure it all goes well. And what's God saying? If you will teach them to trust me, it'll all be taken care of. You see a picture at hand. God was with the lad, and that made all the difference in the world. He says, and he grew, he lived in the wilderness. I mean, he can live out in the middle of a place where nobody else is, and there's not a whole lot of things. The wilderness. And notice the other end, it says, and became an archer, which kind of makes it funnier earlier whenever you see the idea of, she went about a bow's shot away. You just kind of see how the Lord has a little fun here. Then, verse 21. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, which is a little bit further south than the wilderness of Beersheba. And his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So Ishmael marries an Egyptian woman, and anybody want to guess how many sons they have? 12. All right. Then you move on to another aspect and kind of a little bit of a different story, and I'm going to try and cover it in 5 minutes or less. Verse 22. Now it came about at that time that Abimelech, you remember him from Genesis chapter 20? Or excuse me, earlier on. Wasn't Genesis 20. But anyway, go on through. He says, and Phicol, the commander of the army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. That's what Abimelech saw in Abraham. Is that what Abraham saw in Abraham? God is with me in everything I do. Does that make it sound like everything's easy? On the outside looking in, for Abimelech, it's like, everything you touch seems to go well. That's not the way Abraham feels. You ever have people tell you that? Man, it seems like everything that happens to you is always good. And you go, I'm not going to tell you the whole story. Then verse 23. Now therefore, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my posterity, but according to the kindness that I have shown to you, you shall show to me and to the land in which you have sojourned. He says, just show me kindness. Don't deal falsely with me. And notice his response in verse 24. Abraham said, I swear it. And ironically, when we get over to Genesis chapter 26, his son Isaac and wife Rebekah are going to pull the same dumb stunt with the later on Abimelech, because Abimelech's kind of like prime minister or president or chief. It's just kind of a title, not necessarily a specific name. And they're going to do the same thing because Rebekah's going to be so beautiful then. Sometimes things just get handed down that shouldn't be handed down. Then, verse 25. But Abraham complained to Abimelech because of the well of water which the servants of Abimelech had seized. If you remember earlier on in the past, Abimelech had told Abraham, you can live anywhere in the land that you want to live. And that's what had happened, but now the servants of Abimelech had seized one of the wells. Verse 26. And Abimelech said, I do not know what has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor did I hear of it until today. He says, this is the first I've heard of it. He says, I haven't heard of this before. Verse 27. Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. Very specific, a covenant here, between the two of them. Then Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Abimelech said to Abraham, what do these 7 ewe lambs mean, which you have set by themselves? He says, you shall take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, so that it may be a witness to me that I dug this well. He says, these are a witness that this well belongs to me, Abraham, not Abimelech. That's what these seven lambs are about, ewe lambs. Verse 31. Therefore he called that place Beersheba, because there the two of them took an oath. If you take the Hebrew word Beersheba and break it down into a compound, Beer, B-E-R, is the Hebrew word for well. Sheba is the Hebrew word for seven. So Beersheba literally means the well of seven. Fill in the blank, the well of seven ewe lambs. This is Abraham's well, not Abimelech's well. This is their covenant. Verse 32. So they made a covenant at Beersheba, and Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of the army, arose and returned to the land of the Philistines, because Abimelech is the king of the Philistines. You learn that over in Genesis 26. Verse 33. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Tamarisk trees are interesting to read about. Take a few moments and look it up if you'd like to. They can take in 20 gallons of water in one day. They are thirsty trees. They also grow more like a shrub, and over the course of a year, if it's beside a stream, they have been known to grow as many as 12 miles long in 1 year, which gives you an idea. A pretty good way to build a border, right? Well, here's the border. This is at Beersheba. So, you see what happens. Then, but notice specifically at the end of verse 33, and he called on the name of the Lord, the covenant God. He says, the eternal God. And the eternal God is the Hebrew name El Olam. El Olam. And it literally means the God of forever. He's not just the God of now, he's the God of forever. Then, verse 34. And Abraham sojourned in the land of the Philistines for many days. And you realize Abraham stays with these Philistines for a long time. And what I hope you really learn from this second half of Genesis 21 is what to do in the midst of distress. I think you see the right response is, I'm going to respond out of faith to God to do what he desires. Because whenever you do that, that's where you find peace and rest. And you also find great comfort. And at the same time, you see how the Lord has things taken care of if we will only just trust him and submit. He will show us grace. All right. We'll come back next week, hopefully. Genesis 22. I know you've been waiting for this one. All right. Have a good week.
Only let me walk with thee, close to thee, close to thee, close to thee, close to thee. Gladly will I toil and suffer, only let me walk with thee. Lead me through the vale of shadows, bear me o'er life's fitful sea. In the gate of life eternal, may I enter, Lord, with thee. Close to thee, close to thee, close to thee, close to thee. In the gate of life eternal, may I enter, Lord, with thee. Speed away on